Welcome to Talk to Internal Audit, our dedicated Facebook Live series. Today's session is about macroeconomics and geopolitical risk, what it is and why it's important to internal auditors. Our guest today is Derek Leatherdale, who is founder of GRI Strategies and an associate director of the Risk Coalition. He was HSBC's founding global head of geopolitical risk and set up the bank's group geopolitical risk function. Before leading the bank's group government affairs campaign, Derek also had a significant prior experience in national security and intelligence roles for the British government, following several years in the military. GRI works with firms across industry sectors to improve oversight and governance of geopolitical risks and related ESG issues. Derek is the author of several other pieces of thought leadership examining how firms can develop resilience and enhance decision-making in a more geopolitically contested world. So you can see he's a real subject matter expert, and I'm sure the content of his session today is going to be invaluable to us in these particularly challenging times. So grab a drink, tea, water, whatever, and join me as we delve into gaining a better understanding of macroeconomics and geopolitical risk and how we, as internal auditors, need to incorporate them into our planning, both at an annual level and also perhaps at an engagement level. So maybe it's one of those risks that you don't just do once per year, but maybe we need to factor it into a number of the other audit engagements we will undertake across the year. And I'm thinking here around particularly ESG, the audits that you are doing in that space. So, an introduction, who am I? I'm Liz Sandwith, and I'm the Chief Professional Practice Advisor for the Chartered IIA UK and Ireland. And before we get into the stream, a couple of facts about the Institute for you to keep in mind, and these will appear shortly on your screen. As you may be aware, you can acquire CPE points for these Talk to Internal Audit sessions by logging them using our CPE template. Details of how to claim the CPE from this live stream can be found in the comments section. So, as I said earlier, today's topic, macroeconomic and geopolitical risk and why it's important to internal auditors. So, macroeconomic risk derives from the behavior of industries and governments and the relationship between them. It concerns fiscal and monetary policies, trade and investment flows, and political developments on a national and international scale, and the effects of these factors on financial portfolios and company valuations. Intermediate variables of particular importance to macroeconomic risk include equities, commodities market, business cycle, unemployment, inflation, interest rate, prices, and exports and imports, all of which we can hear about daily in news broadcasts, can't we? And I'm sure all of your organization are talking about, if not all of these, a number of those elements. Geopolitical events, generally speaking, occur at the intersection of geographical factors, natural resources, proximity to countries in turmoil, etc. And we have some examples of those, don't we? Policy decision, limits to foreign direct investment, tolerance of corporate elites, etc. And local cultural climates, local perceptions of foreign operators, uncertainty ahead of elections or regime changes. And we have seen those, haven't we, over the last 2 years across the globe. Examples of geopolitical risks are regulatory burdens, violence and civil unrest, and human rights violations. So you can see from those two brief outlines that it is a fairly substantial topic, and something that I'm certain, as I said earlier, you and your organization will be thinking about looking at. And if not, then we as Internal Audit have an obligation to raise some of these questions with our senior management, with our governing body, our audit committee, whomever is appropriate. So moving on, macroeconomic and geopolitical risks have moved up the agenda as the world seems to be going through a period of high political volatility, from trade wars and revolutions to terrorism and insurgents. Geopolitical risks affect all companies, regardless of where they operate, because of their impact on the global economy and on supply chains. Internal auditors may play a major role in raising the profile of these risks at board level and supporting the improvement to both management systems and control processes. None of the current geopolitical risks will disappear anytime soon, and I'm sure we can all agree on that, but new ones will appear. Organizations should be prepared for all scenarios, the worst, the best, and everything in between. Organizations need to know whether they can react quickly to changing circumstances. Internal audit is probably one of the areas of organizations that is best placed to provide assurance on this, and therefore should include macroeconomic and geopolitical risks in their audit plans, subject, of course, to the relevance of the risks to their organizations. Internal audit must ask management questions about how it reviews the company's supply chains and its arrangements for preventing disruption of operation, and whether these are tested regularly. Internal audit should also make clear that while the company's direct exposure to geopolitical risk may be low, indirect exposure via the supply chains and customers may be higher than you anticipate. And that will depend very much on where the company purchases raw materials and sells its goods. The war in Ukraine has sparked a surge in global energy and commodity prices. The main macroeconomic impact of the tragic conflict so far. The shock is largest in Europe, where natural gas prices shot up more than they did during the previous energy price shocks. So lots there for us to think about and explore and reflect upon in terms of our organizations and the impact on them. As the international community's policy response to the situation in Ukraine takes shape, the impact of geopolitics on international business has become starkly apparent, whether in strategic consequences for firms exiting Russia, wider macroeconomic and financial markets volatility, severe impacts on key commodities and raw materials, interruptions to cross-border transactions from financial sanctions and cyber or supply chain disruption, to name but a few. It is clear the business impacts of this geopolitical event touch nearly every aspect of corporate performance. Macroeconomic and political what-if risk scenarios should be included in crisis management, business continuity plans, and your organization's ability to be fluid and adapt to changes in the external environment. Things that are outside of its control, perhaps, come down to its operational resilience. The speed with which companies can adapt has never been more critical, given the unpredictability of political decisions in recent years. But remember, we have something that we can look back on and see how our organizations dealt with a crisis, pandemic. How did your organizations respond quickly? What were the lessons you learned? What were the things from there that you can keep with you as we come into even more challenging times? So internal audit can and should verify that macroeconomic and geopolitical uncertainty is factored into the company's business strategy. It should also assure the existence of strategy-making processes that routinely identify, assess, monitor, update, and incorporate the latest political and economic risks in key markets, and that past experience, remember, pandemic, is included in the strategy-making feedback loop. So I've provided some background, some context in terms of what we're looking at today. And our session will look at how internal auditors can adapt approaches to support their organizations in this new era of geopolitical risk. What might they be looking at, we be looking at, and how can we provide assurance to our boards, audit committees, senior management, that these geopolitical challenges are being effectively considered and mitigated. So this session today is in terms of Talk to Internal Audit. We'll explore these questions with our guest, Derek Leatherdale. Remember, if you like Facebook streams and want to spread the word, and I'm sure you do, be sure to share today's live stream. And you can do so by clicking the share button in the corner of your screen. After all, the more the merrier. So if you're just joining us, welcome to our live stream Talk to Internal Audit. Our guest speaker today is Derek Leatherdale, who is founder and managing director of GRI Strategies Limited, leading work with companies across sectors to improve approaches to management of geopolitical risk exposures. And today's session is about understanding macroeconomics and geopolitical risks. So may I introduce my guest for today, Derek Leatherdale. So Derek, perhaps you could start by introducing yourself with some background that leads you to be where you are today.
Indeed, and Liz, many thanks for the invitation to join you today, and for those words of introduction. And let me just try and put a bit of extra, if you like, context to that portion of my background that you've already introduced. So as you mentioned, I started my career in national security and in intelligence roles for the British government. But then I then joined the private sector and HSBC to provide political analysis for them in the bank's group headquarters in London. And really the kind of story of where I am today and what I'm doing today really tracks back to that point, because when I joined HSBC, as I'm sure many of your listeners will be aware, HSBC is an incredibly international organization. It operates in sort of 70 to 80 odd markets globally. In fact, when I joined, it was operating in an even greater number of markets across a very diverse range of business lines and against some, if you like, very interesting political risk context and backgrounds. And when I joined, I found it amazing that HSBC didn't have a more formal and centralized capacity to think about those political and increasingly geopolitical risks, and that in the absence of that capacity, if you like, at a headquarters level, there wasn't really any structure or process or any kind of framework or systematic methodology that was applied to consideration of these kinds of questions. And so I set up the group's geopolitical risk function to try and rectify that. It seemed such a big gap for a bank like HSBC with such a heavily international footprint and so exposed to developments in the global economy, that plugging that gap seemed like a really important thing to do. And the first step was, if you like, creating some analytical capability. And then the second step was then sort of working out how to if you like, wire that into the organization's decision-making processes in a sort of structured and systematic way. And that really was the experience of nearly 7 years trying to sort of develop and evolve the bank's capability to do this. I then moved off into a government affairs role, but then on leaving the bank, it struck me that what businesses in general don't have is, if you like, a kind of a framework and a methodology for thinking through the kinds of issues that you've just outlined, Liz, and the way they may track into and affect their organizations, and the way they can then start thinking about managing those impacts, and potentially, by the way, exploiting some of the opportunities that come from geopolitical volatility. So I set up GRI really to try and help other firms, really based on that experience in HSBC of trying to bring some sort of systemic approach to management decision making, to risk management, and to governance. And that's really the kind of background that brings me to where I am today. The other element I would just briefly outline, Liz, is you know, as you mentioned, I'm also an associate director at the Risk Coalition. The reason for that is that as I've started work with GRI, it's very obvious, or it was very obvious indeed when I set the firm up, that there wasn't really an instruction manual for companies about, you know, what they should be doing on these kinds of issues, how they could operate in a more effective way, whether that was first line management teams, whether that's corporate functions, internal audit, or indeed boards and their risk oversight committees and or audit committees. And so I've worked with the Risk Coalition over the last year or 18 months to produce what is, I think, the first guidance for firms on how they can operate more effectively on this sort of increasingly complex, increasingly volatile, if you like, external agenda.
Thank you, Derek. So without being in any way patronizing, a subject matter expert for us today that will help our listeners better understand what appears to be a very broad topic area that seems to, as I've already articulated, covered quite a variety of different things. So what I thought you might like to do is just take a few minutes to share with us your understanding of macroeconomics and geopolitical risk based on the work that you've done at HSBC, the work that you've done with other businesses in terms of identifying some of these risks and how they have perhaps dealt with them.
Yeah, so this is very often the first question I'm asked: what is this thing called geopolitical risk? It's often a question that is sort of anchored in a sense that, as you said, Liz, you know, geopolitics is something that by and large governments do to each other. It's the result of government policy decision making, often in response to what other governments are doing, and increasingly in this environment, geopolitical volatility is being driven by, if you like, the increasing salience of national security concerns amongst governments, and then them using the policy levers available or at their disposal to respond to those national security concerns and direct those policy responses to governments or against governments whom they regard as perhaps less than friendly or operating in a way inimical to their own interests. So often there's this sort of sense, I think, in business of geopolitics. These are these big issues. It's mostly a government thing. It's not something, therefore, that we as a business have any direct control over. It's really hard to get our head around what it all means for us anyway. So probably the best thing for us to do is just sort of either hope or pretend it's not happening, or stick our head in the sand, because if there's nothing we can do to control it at source, then there's not a lot of point, you know, expending effort to think about it. Just as a sort of another general point by way of context, I think as a sort of paradigm, if you like, for business, that kind of worked 15, 20 years ago when I first joined HSBC, because then I think the overwhelming sense was that geopolitics or political risk was something that applied, if you like, primarily to a relatively small number of what certainly in the financial sector they would have called emerging markets. And I think for that language would be familiar, I'm sure, to those in other industry sectors too. But to the extent that geopolitical risk was an issue, it sort of was localized and really concentrated in sort of strategically some less important markets. I think what's happened in the years since then is that geopolitics has gone from being sort of, as it were, kind of a fringe issue in emerging markets to something that you can pretty much see manifesting across most of the global economy in one way or another. And this really became apparent to me in HSBC when, having set up the geopolitical risk function, all of a sudden the Arab Spring sort of, in a sense, came from nowhere. And it wasn't just, if you like, a social upheaval in one market in the Middle East and North Africa. It triggered a cascade of stability questions and issues for many other markets in the region. Likewise, the Eurozone debt crisis became a sort of, if you like, a partly geopolitical problem in the 2010s. And so I think we've been in a sort of a transition period where political risk as a concept has gone from being fringe to progressively now something that applies across more or less most of the global economy and including developed markets, in a way that sort of 15, 20 years ago CEOs would have said, political risk doesn't apply to me because we only operate in stable countries, or words to that effect. So to sort of bring that forward then to what do, when I'm talking about geopolitical risk with companies, I think part of the discussion then quickly becomes, actually, you need to think about geopolitical risk, not in a sort of intellectually pure definitional sense of, it's a sort of series of interactions between governments, but much more in practical terms about how the consequences of geopolitical volatility may affect your organization. And that's really the sort of key bridge, kind of intellectual bridge into making this more real in a corporate environment. And if you start to map out some of the impacts of geopolitics, you can start to see quite how wide-ranging those impacts can be. And you mentioned some of them, Liz, in your introduction. The idea, for instance, that a geopolitical shock or indeed geopolitical trends can drive macroeconomic performance and degrade macroeconomic performance. The idea that a geopolitical event can introduce a great deal of uncertainty and volatility into financial markets. The idea that it can drive a very sharp and sort of high velocity movements in key commodities markets, which again you touched on, Liz. So on the kind of financial side, you suddenly can see, when you start to map some of these issues out, that geopolitics can have some very real, if you like, financial risk impacts for organizations. But it's not just that. There's a sort of slew of other things. And something that you touched on, Liz, very briefly was the linkage with ESG. And of course, ESG planning is, for companies, an increasingly important element of what they're doing. But I think it's less well appreciated quite how a geopolitically more antagonistic environment can complicate some of those ESG decisions. And so, to give you for instance, electric vehicles, I think generally people would say electric vehicles are a good thing, but some of the raw materials that go into making them, lithium and rare earths in particular, are already sort of geopolitically extremely sensitive materials, and the acquisition and sourcing of them is already sort of subject to a kind of geopolitical context. And I think often in the corporate world, that linkage is not necessarily well understood. So there's definitely a read across into the ESG sort of agenda as well on this. And that, I think, is again part of what when I'm talking about geopolitical risk, that's what I'm talking about, if you like. And that's quite apart from, some of those other things that probably people would already sort of naturally associate with geopolitics. One is cyber risk, an elevated cyber risk. Another is supply chain risk, which you touched on, Liz. I think there's a piece too around human rights and reputation as well for companies. And then, of course, I think what Ukraine has also showed the international business community is that where they're operating across a geopolitical fault line, it could be that a geopolitical event has strategic consequences for their operations, up to the point where we've seen companies announcing sometimes billions of dollars of losses in order to exit their operations in Russia. Now, that's a kind of a fairly quick run through of what is quite a wide-ranging landscape. I think probably if you ask me, on the back of that, what's the one thing internal auditors need to sort of do as a consequence of that, I would simply say this: it's to try and ensure that their organizations, or at least challenge if their organizations are thinking of geopolitics solely in respect of, say, supply chain, or solely in respect of cyber. I mean, it's not a bad place to start, but perhaps those organizations need to think more holistically as well, and to think of the impacts of geopolitical risk in wider terms. That, I'm afraid, just to kind of conclude, is compounded in its complexity, Liz, as we've discussed before, by the idea that in a globalized economy, your exposure as an organization to geopolitical risk, or the impacts of geopolitical risk, is not really simply a function of where you operate. It can very much more be a function of the markets in which you operate, any particular exposures you may have either on the sort of demand or the supply side of your operation. And many of those exposures can be indirect. And so, as you noted, Liz, in your introduction, the idea that sharp rises in oil and gas prices as a consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, actually some of the impacts for that for businesses, that might be felt by a business in France, which depends, and its business model relies on sort of elevated levels of, say, a consumer disposable income. They may find that the impact then is felt that because consumers in France, or indeed other countries around the world, don't have as much disposable income because they're spending more on heating and energy and fuel for their vehicles.
I think those are all absolutely first class in terms of helping us better understand, Derek. And a couple of things there resonated. You talked about disposable incomes, and I've been talking to colleagues in social housing, for example, in the UK, and know already that some of the residents in those homes are talking about, we either heat the home or we feed the family. The option to do both is now becoming increasingly challenging. And I saw on the news a lady talking about, I try and keep the home warm and feed the children, but that might mean I only have one meal a day because there isn't any sort of funding to cover all of that. So sometimes when people say disposable income, they think about, the going out for a meal, going on holiday, going to the cinema. Actually, some of this now is using disposable income to survive rather than do other things. So yeah. I think some of what's coming out from what you've said so far, and you also use the word consequences, and I think from an internal audit perspective, what we can also look at under this heading of macroeconomic geopolitical risk is the consequences. What other risks across our business are exacerbated by fuel prices, by supply chains, by sanctions, perhaps, all of those, cost of living, inflation, all of those sorts of things, is something that we as internal audit can contribute to the discussion around the table. So what I wanted to then ask you was, do you think that macroeconomic geopolitical risks are being factored into organizations' business strategy and decision making, Or do you think we're still, as you talked about 15 years ago, going, no, nothing to do with me?
I think there's, Liz, I think there's a fair amount of the latter still. And of course, that, I'm not, I don't think anyone would suggest that every single commercial organization or indeed other entity is uniformly exposed to these sorts of issues. And exposure, I think, to the consequences of geopolitical issues and events does depend on an individual firm's business model or individual organization's operating model. It does depend to some extent on geography. It will depend on supply chain dependencies, or if you like, consumer, the consumer impacts of geopolitical issues. So whilst this is sort of rising as an issue, and there's no doubt of that, and I think there's no doubt that it's affecting more firms, or the downstream consequences of geopolitics are affecting more organizations, more firms in more places than for a long time. I think it's probably fair to say that there will be some organizations who are to some extent less affected. And you could perhaps then say, well, I'm sure they do have other things that they would want to be concerned by and worried about. But more broadly, for that sort of segment of organizations who are exposed to some or all of these issues, I think the picture is a very sort of mixed one. I think, I hear people say a lot, we could never have predicted Ukraine. So we're reacting, and we're struggling to sort of calibrate what to do now. But it came completely out of the blue. And my response back, I mean, depending on the nature of the conversation, is to say, well, actually, for weeks and months beforehand, there were a series of very well-founded intelligence warnings that might have given you pause as an organization to consider whether you might want to do some contingency planning around this kind of issue, rather than waiting for something to happen. But I think that's indicative, and I mention that because businesses, I think, by and large, haven't sort of grasped it, if you like, more proactive work on this agenda. I mean, typically I find corporate practice on this sort of falls back to a fairly standard default position in organizations. Quite often, firms will have geopolitics on their risk register, or for some larger firms, they will put geopolitical issues into what they call their strategic and emerging risks framework. Both of those are often synonyms for not doing a great deal about them. In effect, they're kind of placeholders, and you see that reflected when you then ask those organizations, well, okay, who leads work on the geopolitics entry on your risk register? Or how do you spin off analytical work to try and understand what the business consequences of geopolitics will be when they are in your strategic and emerging risks framework? And often the answer is, we don't really have a sort of single lead for this. We don't really do anything about it. And frankly, we've got enough of a day job to do anyway. So that we don't really have time to sort of focus on some of these sort of higher level things. And I sort of say that with kind of two particular points in mind. One is on the risk register side, and I think you just mentioned this, Liz, sort of implicitly. It's actually, you quite often find that geopolitics is a driver of risks that an organization already recognize and may already be working on, but that their approach doesn't recognize those linkages. So they don't think, and in their risk activity and risk planning, they won't necessarily think to make the links between, say, a geopolitical issue or an event and some of those other, if you like, particularly financial risks or financial issues that they may actually have a great deal of sort of capability and expertise to work on anyway. But the second point I would perhaps draw out, and again, sort of thinking about what does this mean for an internal audit team, I think one of the things, one of the thoughts here is go and find out if your organization has geopolitics on the risk register or in its strategic and emerging risks framework, or some other point in its risk activity, and then ask, what work does this actually give rise to? What sort of flows off this element of our risk framework, and is it really adequate in conditions of sort of increasing geopolitical uncertainty and instability?
Really good points, and I couldn't help but smile when you said, could people have anticipated this? I was on the Ukraine issue I'm referring to. I was on a risk coalition roundtable that was looking and exploring Ukraine, and there were chief risk officers from a variety of well-known organizations. And one of them said, we knew this was coming way back in 2014. So this isn't a black swan, because we keep using, oh, this must be a black swan because we had no way of knowing it was coming. The same we did with pandemic. We said, no way. World Economic Forum had been talking about pandemics for 5 or 6 years before it hit. So I think sometimes that's a bit of an easy excuse for organizations to not have prepared in any way for some of this coming down the track, or at least considered what the implications might be. So from your experience, are you aware of organizations having really strong resilience plans in place that would help them deal with trade measures, geopolitical risk, whatever that might come down the track? Or are you seeing organizations making it up on the hoof, if you like?
Probably on balance, Liz, more of the latter than the former. I mean, when you use the language of business resilience, I think many in the that's very often taken to be synonymous with business continuity, which I think in its sort of slightly more old-fashioned sense is taken to be, we've got direct exposure in a market where something bad is happening. So, we've got an office building in Kiev, and we therefore need a plan to ensure that our operations can continue to run if we can no longer get our staff into the building. And I think, when I sort of engage people and you sort of talk about resilience, they will default sometimes to thinking about, yes, we need a backup office. And, that's absolutely sort of fine and relevant for an organization that had, if you like, physical presence in Ukraine. And makes perfect sense. But I think so much of the impacts of geopolitics now are felt remotely and at second or third hand, that the sort of the concept of resilience is something that would benefit from expanding from, if you like, physical resilience much more to an operational resilience, much more to financial resilience, and sort of thinking about resilience of the business model as a whole, rather than thinking about it as a sort of simply an operational or maybe a kind of cyber outage type challenge, or indeed office outage type challenge. I mean, there are probably 2 prior points I could pick out at this juncture, Liz. One is that, and picking up on the roundtable that you mentioned, it's very easy to think that if you're, say, a chief risk officer, of course you should be, monitoring the world around you and drawing on the best analytical capabilities to understand what's going on, and then pushing through loads and loads of sort of contingency planning against a potentially quite wide range of risks and disruptive external events. I got a little bit more sympathy for them in that just geopolitics as an issue, I think, is not something where the kind of analytical expertise is typically held within a chief risk officer's team, or a head of risks team. So yes, there'll probably be a line item in the risk register or in the strategic emerging risks framework. But if you approach a CRO or a head of risk and say, okay, upon what source of expertise do you draw, bearing in mind that I don't know of a single CRO or head of risk who him or herself is a geopolitical analyst. If you ask them, upon what source of expertise do you draw for geopolitical issues, they will probably say, I don't. It's not a core discipline in a risk function. I might need credit risk analysts. I'll need some economists. I'll probably need some, some accountancy or financial risk specialists. But I don't think that sort of generally the risk profession has cottoned on to the idea of needing some geopolitical expertise sort of as part of their analytical repertoire. And so in a sense, I don't blame them that they didn't necessarily cotton on to what was happening in respect of Ukraine beforehand. And I think the other thing I'd probably say, and this goes back to the crux of your question, are organizations making this up on the hoof and reacting to events rather than predicting? I think they are generally. I'm on a sort of a bit of a personal mission to try and change that. But I think part of the reason is that no one's yet or until now really produced the instruction manual, which a company management team or a board or a corporate planning function can pick up and say, okay, this is what we can do in practical terms to start thinking through some of these issues ahead of time. Without that kind of playbook, it would be termed in the US, without that instruction manual, it's perhaps not surprising that corporate management teams, are somewhat on the back foot with these kinds of issues. In providing the kind of instruction manual and a framework for more systematic and proactive activity on these sorts of issues, I think that is something that hopefully will help organizations sort of approach this less reactively, more proactively, and start thinking through some of those contingencies in advance. And again, sort of to bring it to an internal audit audience, I think internal audit has such a key role in helping their organizations sort of do this more effectively. And the guidance that I mentioned that we produce with the Risk Coalition, actually has a fairly substantial chunk of its thoughts, its ideas, its recommendations for practical action, have a strong sort of element of internal audit involvement to try and make sure that an organization is, approaching these issues more systematically and ahead of time.
I think as well, when I was thinking resilience, I was thinking across all of the areas that you mentioned. And I was also thinking from a board and an internal audit perspective, thinking about, things like stress testing. So organizations need to do their stress testing. They need to be looking to the point where, potentially things start to go wrong and what they need to do to address that. And I know a number of organizations were beginning to include Ukraine in their stress testing in around February time this year. But I'm certain that that's not all organizations.
Yeah. Well, and I assume, by February, whether they had started that just before the invasion or to coincide with it, by that stage, the warnings coming in particular from what in government terms would be known as the Five Eyes governments were reaching sort of a fever pitch. There were daily warnings about Russian military intentions. You could argue that it's better to start sort of incorporating geopolitical issues, particularly into financial viability modeling generally. Sort of better to do that late than never. But it's certainly one of the areas where, in terms of contingency planning, building financial resilience by thinking through the impacts of downside geopolitical scenarios on balance sheets is I think an increasingly important part. And just to kind of circle back to an element of the conversation earlier, people have in mind that yes, geopolitics, that's an operational disruption issue, or it's a supply chain issue, or it's a cyber issue. But they haven't necessarily sort of joined the dots with the financial impacts of geopolitical disruption, and how then, the sort of, if you like, the appropriate response to that is to start weaving in geopolitical factors into financial viability modeling, and particularly future-focused financial viability modeling, in a way that wouldn't necessarily be obvious. And again, absolutely, I would regard internal audit as having a role in that, not the least of which is to say, okay, in our financial viability analyses, have we accounted for, a geopolitical issue where we think it might be relevant? And that's absolutely key for me.
Thank you very much. We've heard, and we've probably all seen it all over the press, stories about high-profile organizations pulling out of Russia, McDonald's, KFC, I think, Marks and Spencer's, etc. What do you think will be the impact of those decisions on perhaps small to medium-sized organizations in UK and Ireland? For example, in terms of, will they need to restructure their operations to protect profits? Will they need to find new customers, new suppliers? What do you think the outlook might be?
Well, I think to some extent depends on the quantum, if you like, of their exposure to those issues. But where those larger firms have exited Russia, and if, for instance, a range of smaller firms in the UK and Ireland, in this case, are suppliers to those larger firms, they may find that there's an impact that, if you like, flows down from those exits. I mean, more broadly, this it would depend on the corporate entity in question, Liz, but I think sort of at a kind of grander level, there's what's happened has opened up a series of questions around the ongoing, if you like, utility or applicability of globalized business models, and sort of thrown up a series of awkward questions, if you like, about where geopolitical fault lines, and it's not just Russia, Ukraine, you can point to them in any number of other parts of the world, and in respect of the UK and Ireland, clearly ongoing tension between the EU and the UK over the application of the Northern Ireland Protocol is perhaps a kind of an example of something that's a bit closer to home and would have material impacts for business, but where the idea of a sort of borderless world in which businesses, small, medium and large, can operate pretty much wherever they like without constraint or without interruption, or run supply chains from wherever they like, I think is a concept that's coming under increasing strain. And I would argue it's been coming under increasing strain really since the global financial crisis. But what issues that flow from Ukraine show or have done is to bring that into much sharper relief. What I find interesting too, and I think is really sort of notable from a governance point of view, is how many of the organizations who've exited Russia have done so making some very substantial losses in the process. I mean, billions of dollars on occasion. And I think there's a really interesting set of governance questions that gives rise to. And in particular, for some of those very large organizations, you're talking some substantial and material losses from if you like, a failure to anticipate and a response that therefore has essentially been extremely reactive.
I couldn't help but smile. I think, you make some valid points there, and we may well see things like redundancies in some of those organizations in the UK and Ireland because of, the losses in terms of pulling out of Russia. But I was also thinking you were talking about further down the stream in terms of the consequences. And my husband is a dairy farmer, and he's already, identified challenges around fertilizer. He's anticipating problems around straw in the autumn, looking ahead, thinking what can we buy now and store for the future. So I think all of this, it impacts people perhaps that you hadn't even begun to think about. Because, if we don't have any fertilizer, we don't grow grass, the cows don't eat, they don't produce milk, and therefore, that touches everyone's lives. And I'm not suggesting we alone are the only providers, but you can see how some of the consequences touch even small organizations, very small organizations.
Very much. I think that's a really germane point, Liz, and others will, other analysts have pointed to, for instance, the consequences for the rise in food prices in general, but in particular the rise in bread prices, and how that may play out in a number of states in other parts of the world, which import a great deal of their food and a great deal of their bread, or the wheat to make bread. And likewise, higher oil and gas prices, how that can cascade through to other economies, other markets, other countries, in ways that could actually be quite serious for their own stability and if you like, economic security. So I think to come back to the central point in my mind, what Ukraine has shown is when we all live in a globalized economy, it doesn't matter from a UK perspective that the geopolitical shock was 1,500 miles away. The downstream consequences economically and financially will feed through. And I think, well, clearly your husband is sort of on the front line of a particular vector of that. The piece around fertilizer prices I find fascinating. It'd be really interesting to know. I mean, another UK example I saw the other day, Ukraine is a very substantial producer of sunflower oil. And supplies have been heavily disrupted, and there are a number of UK food manufacturers who rely heavily on sunflower oil in their cooking processes, and are now scrabbling for alternatives and trying to find alternative supplies on global markets, and where, of course, the natural, if you like, market adjustment has been towards higher prices. And I suppose the challenge back is, did you anticipate this? What plans did you have in place? I think we saw similar with a number of those companies, electricity and gas companies, Liz, that started to fail back in the autumn of last year, where it was quite clear at the time that Russia was to some extent restricting its supply of gas to European markets, and that was feeding through to some very severe financial pressures for a number of those particularly smaller energy companies, but where it was also quite clear that many of them hadn't hedged against some of those price rises. And when we're thinking about sort of geopolitical risk and mitigation, I mean, on the financial side, hedging and or diversification of sources of supply can be, by the way, these are sort of strategies that many firms are very well used to using against other kinds of risks, but they can be exactly the right sort of response for organizations to look at adopting.
Absolutely. We're coming to the end of our time, so I'd just like to ask you very briefly if you could share perhaps 3 takeaways, 3 things that you want people to remember from this session.
Yeah, so well, sort of as it were off the top of my head, Liz, but I hope in a way that's easy to remember. I think the first point I would make is that there is probably an inclination, or there may well be an inclination amongst management teams in the companies of those who are listening, to regard what's happened in Eastern Europe as a kind of a one-off, and that sooner or later the world will kind of track back to normal. I think the sort of quote unquote, I think what I would encourage and urge those listening to think, or to at least consider, is the idea that, in fact, no, that we won't go back to the status quo ante, that we've been transitioning into a more volatile geopolitical era for some years now. And this is a trend that is systemic and that will be sustained, and actually ultimately will be driven by developments in the US-China relationship. And given the absolute centrality of their economies to the global economy, I think the paradigm here is shifting. Ukraine is not a one-off, and that businesses and organizations will need to think about this being a kind of a new normal that they will have to operate in. So that's kind of point number 1. Point number 2 is, therefore, I think the response that organizations are putting in place to the pressures caused by Ukraine is, I think, by and large, a reactive and very often a crisis management response, but that I would encourage organizations to think longer term, and that they need to be or would benefit from thinking about how they can adjust their planning processes, how they can adjust their management decision making, how they can adjust their governance and evolve it so that these kinds of issues don't come as such a shock in the future, and that they can develop resilience over a longer time frame against a sort of global context that is you know, as I say, moving systemically towards more instability. And then I think the third point, Liz, is I think internal audit have a huge role to play in that by challenging organizations on some of those points, you know, and you know, where necessary, sort of asking difficult questions or asking probing questions about how organizations are responding to this sort of, if you like, paradigm shift in the global geopolitical landscape. So those would be my top three. I appreciate they're quite high level and general, but I think sort of capture the essence. Well, if I could add a fourth, Liz, if you know, if listeners want some tips on what better approaches look like, you know, the guidance we produce with the Risk Coalition is I think probably as good a starting point as there is for this.
Thank you ever so much, Derek. Some really great things for us to think about and reflect upon. And as you say, the Risk Coalition produces blogs, and I've just been looking today at the one that they've just done on the Ukraine crisis and the role of risk committees. So, you know, those are all free and available. So I'm sure our listeners will tap into those. So thank you very much. In conclusion, I just want to say macroeconomic geopolitical uncertainty is having a strong impact, as Derek has just said, on many other areas, such as financial stability, supply chain, business continuity, and even human capital, diversity and talent management. In our increasingly globalized and interconnected world, the impact of a single event or shift in policy can have on an organization can be magnified through a complex web of interrelated risks and themes, again, as Derek has been talking about. The physical location of premises, complex supply chains, geographically mobile workforces, and cyber connectivity have led to greater risk exposure emanating from cross-border transfer of goods and currency exchange, as well as employee and customer movement. So understanding geopolitical driven risk impacts and managing them across an organization is essential. And as Derek has also said, something that internal audit can probe within your organization. As businesses battle against soaring energy prices, rising inflation, supply chain issues, disrupted workplace, and so on, internal audit should look at macroeconomic and geopolitical uncertainty more closely than perhaps they are currently doing. Perhaps it is an area that internal audit functions should integrate in all of their audits, as opposed to a standalone one. So if you're just joining us, welcome to our live stream Talk to Internal Audit. Our guest speaker today was Derek Leatherdale, who is founder and managing director of GRI Strategies Limited. And he leads work with companies across sectors to improve approaches to management of geopolitical risk exposures. And our session was around understanding macroeconomic and geopolitical risk. So may I say a huge thank you to Derek for joining me today and for sharing his thoughts with us. Lots for us to reflect upon and share with our internal audit colleagues and our organizations. The live stream is available afterwards for those of your friends, colleagues who may have missed the live version on the Institute's Facebook channel. Follow all of the exciting things the Institute is doing on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. In March this year, we published our risk overview, Human Capital, Diversity and Talent Management. The risk overview examines the risk from two perspectives: the practice of auditing human capital, diversity and talent management as a risk area, and the extent to which human capital, diversity and talent issues impact the work of internal audit functions themselves. And this risk overview overlaps with our Risk in Focus 2022 report, which, if you haven't read it, is worth a read. And also, if you're asked to complete the Risk in Focus 2023 survey, please make sure you do. In case you've not already checked it out, the Institute has a community hub for all of you to get involved in. A new gateway to all our community-focused activities and endeavours, including our virtual forums, regional network, and volunteering opportunities. There you'll find a list of all our special interest groups, so if there are any that pique your interest, reach out. Community Hub is open to all members and non-members, so watch this space as it continues to take shape over the coming months. We have an online training course delivering audit insights within macroeconomics. And during that course, you will learn about economic cycles, key macroeconomic indicators, and the interplay between them. Macroeconomics contributes to the uncertainties that your organization grapples with. And the knowledge you will gain from this course will also form part of your armor when providing insightful assurance and advising on risk. As we move forward, please don't forget to look out for Talk to Internal Audit. All of our live streams to date can be found on our YouTube channel. So if you haven't watched any yet, be sure to subscribe. A link to our YouTube channel can be found in the comments section. And we will continue to share with you our thoughts regarding specific challenges, along with input from colleagues, members, and guests. So please stay in touch. If you have any specific topics you'd like us to cover, please share your thoughts in the comments box. And I'm always happy to take questions, and you can email me at liz.sandwith@iia.org.uk. Remember, talk to Internal Audit, because the Institute is listening. Thank you for joining us. See you next time. Bye.